An anthology about the bad, the short lived, and the forgotten shows and events in television history. This is It Was a Thing on TV.
Punisher! Control!
Harry, before I change my mind!
I give you Super Train.
Episode 495, submission number 2591, Laugh-In. Not to be confused with Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. We'll get to more about that a little bit later. Laugh-In aired on NBC from September 5th of 1977 to February 8th of 1978 for 6 episodes scattered throughout the 1977-1978 season. Before we can get into the story of Laugh-In from 1977, we got to go back to 1967 to the original Laugh-In, to Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. Surely you know about Laugh-In, hosted by Dan Rowan and Dick Martin. Just the constant stream of jokes, humor, sight gags, performances. It wasn't just humor. There were also even dance performances. It was basically a variety show, and it ran from 1967 all the way to 1973. And gosh, the people that came out of that show, they went on to superstardom, talking about people like Joanne Worley, Ruth Buzzy, Goldie Hawn. The names just go on and on. A lot of stars came from the original Laugh-In. It was actually quite controversial at the time for what they were doing, but also they did get a little bit of flack for having Richard Nixon come on and say, "Suck it to me?" Because I think that was right in the middle of the 68 election, and you have to do equal time, obviously, and I don't think there was any equal time there, and Laugh-In was one of the biggest shows on TV. So now you fast forward to 1977, and early in 1977, January 15th, NBC announced that they're bringing back Laugh-In for 6 specials in the 1977-78 season. It's not a regular series. It's very sporadic, and I've got the 6 air dates, and when we go through the episodes, I'll give those air dates, and you can really see it's very spread out. There's really no rhyme or reason as to maybe when the episodes aired. This version of Laugh-In was very similar to what you had on the original version, except it was updated a little bit. If you remember the original Laugh-In, one of the frequent segments they have is the party, where after Dick Martin and Dan Rowan generally introduce the show, do some sort of little monologue, they open up these doors, and there's this party, sort of like a 60s nightlife type of party. You had some go-go dancers, and you had people on the cast dancing, and they'd focus in on one person, and they'd tell a little joke, or they'd have a little dialogue between themselves, 2 of the cast members, or a cast member and special guest, or whatnot. They did that on the 77 version, but it wasn't a party per se. Of course, it's 1977, so it's not a party. It's a disco. And the person who was the DJ of the disco, and we'll get into the names in a little bit, the DJ for this party was Bill Rafferty. And he'd have his turntable there. He'd have his stack of wax, his records going on. And it was the exact same thing. Little rapid fire jokes for 5 minutes, zoom in on one of the cast members, and they give a joke, or there's dialogue between 2 people, again, giving a timely joke. Very similar to the party, but again, more updated. Some of the other segments that carried over, they did a news segment, not unlike what they did in the original version of Laugh-In. But one thing they did is, instead of just talking about news of the day, they also did some little sight gags, some little puns with a typewriter, where there was stationery with the Laugh-In logo as a letterhead, and something was typed out real fast and it would go up the paper as the typing was being done. So, it's sort of like what you'd see if somebody was typing out a book or something and, just scrolls it up a couple of inches and you can see the text there. Just little sight puns like that. And seemingly they had probably, I'd say, between like 4 and 6 of those during the news segment. And they had the joke wall, which was how the original Laugh-In ended. And that's how this version maybe not ended, but it was a later segment in the show, did a very similar thing, but it was not as, oh my gosh, how do I phrase this? Mod, hip. Yeah, it didn't have all those colors and the graphics, and all the doors were different shapes and whatnot back in the 60s and early 70s. For the late 70s, it was almost like a grid of doors, of square doors. And there were a couple of doors on the floor, so somebody might pop up from the floor and make a joke. They did that as well. The show from the 60s and 70s really didn't differ much from the 77 version, except maybe when it came to the talent and the humor, because some of the jokes just fell flat. Some were good. I'm not going to lie there, but there's a reason this only lasted 6 specials. So getting into the particulars of this series, we have a huge cast. Really, there is no opening. That's why you didn't hear any opening music. So there is no order as to when they showed the different cast members. So we'll do this in sort of a kind of a reverse order in terms of saving the best for last. Not saying that the people that we're going to start off with are bad, just we're going to save the big names for the end. So among our regular performers, we had a lady by the name of Nancy Bleiweiss, or Bleiweiss. And if you believe her IMDb, and I certainly do, this was the only show she was on. She did Laugh-In, and she did the related TV movie, The Great American Laugh-Off, and that's it.
Talk about going out on a high note.
Well, I think that's one thing you're going to notice about this series is there's some really good names, but then there's some people, where the heck did they go? They just disappeared off the face of the earth. That actually isn't just for, like I said, this Nancy Bleiweiss. There's another couple people on this show doing research where they just fell off the face of the earth in the late 70s and early 80s. We'll get to those people in a little bit. We also had Sergio Aragones on the show. And first and foremost, the day we're recording this is his 87th birthday. So happy birthday to Sergio Aragones. And if that name is familiar, oh my gosh, he has done so much stuff, and you have seen his work, even if you don't recognize the name. He did, maybe he does. I don't know if he does this for Mad Magazine any longer. I don't think so, but he did cartoon work for Mad Magazine for ages. I remember him back in the 70s doing this, in the 80s, and I think he did it well into the 2010s. I think maybe possibly he stopped doing it after Mad Magazine formally ended, because I think they've been doing primarily like reruns the last 5 or so years.
But there's one thing you'd best know from Mad Magazine. Spy versus Spy.
Oh, the best. That is one of the best regular segments in Mad Magazine. Also with the fold-in, too. I mean, you got to give Al Jaffe credit. Those were so creative. But also, you definitely saw Sergio Aragones' work on TV bloopers and practical jokes. And actually, some of the sight gags that you see on this show, they were done by Sergio Aragones. Some of the stuff he did was similar to what you saw on the original Laugh-In, with little one-liners just flashing on the screen, but he did it in animated form. But also he did other types of sight gags, like with a woman in a bikini lying on a blanket or at a beach. He would do little things with her belly button, like somebody would stick like a flagpole into the belly button and water would erupt, or somebody would look into the belly button and fall into the belly button. Just different little sight gags like that. He also did numerous transitions and wipes throughout the episode when they went from scene to scene. And again, when you see his artwork, you'll be like, I've seen that. Might have been Mad Magazine, might have been TV's bloopers and practical jokes, but he's done, gosh, so much stuff over the years. The next person I'm going to bring up is Jim Giovanni. He was on all 6 episodes. And Jim Giovanni, well, he's not around any longer because he passed away in October of 2016. And really, sort of like Nancy Blyvice we talked about earlier, he's primarily known for Laugh-In in 1977 and that The Great American Laugh-Off movie we talked about earlier as well. Only other credits were The Best of Times. I don't remember that from 1986. But also, he was a police sergeant in Tucker, The Man in His Dream, if you remember that movie from 1988. I remember that movie.
Yeah, with Jeff Bridges.
Right, as the car inventor, car creator, car designer, as the car bigwig. Yeah, easy for me to say. Next up is Michael Sklar. And again, Michael Sklar, not really known for much of anything outside of Laugh-In, but I think more importantly, he actually passed away in 1984 at the age of 39. Next is Antoinette Attell, and believe it or not, what are her 2 credits? Laugh-In and The Great American Laugh-Off. So again, another person who had just this in his or her career. Next, we talked about him earlier, Bill Rafferty. He was one of the few people who had quite a successful career after Laugh-In. He was on Real People. He also hosted the nighttime Card Sharks in syndication back in 1986. He hosted Blockbusters, Every Second Counts. He had actually quite a, I don't want to say long career, but he had a career definitely outside of Laugh-In. Next is a gentleman by the name of Ed Bluestone. And actually, in one of the articles that I read doing some research for this episode, he was like the primary big talent that was like the first person they brought aboard. He was a comedian. I think the powers that be, talking about George Slatter, maybe NBC, saw him performing at whatever, the Comedy Store or whatever comedy club of note there was in 1976, 77. And he was like the big name or the big talent that was brought aboard the show. Really, his career didn't go anywhere after Laugh-In. And actually, if you take a look at his IMDb, that was his only role in terms of being an actor. He did some stuff on other shows. He did a week of Hollywood Squares in 1978. He did a number of talk shows. He did a couple of Dean Martin celebrity roasts. But really, the last thing he did was he did an episode of Late Night with David Letterman in 1982, and that was basically the last time he was on TV. He has come up in a couple of retrospectives, and I think he's even done a podcast. But actually, the one place you would know Ed Bluestone from, not even on a TV show, if you guys remember the National Lampoon magazine cover from 1973, where it was a picture of a dog looking to the left or to the side, and there's a gun held to his head, and it says, "Buy this magazine or we're going to shoot this dog." I'm sure you guys have seen that. Have you?
Yes.
If you've seen that magazine cover, that was actually created by Ed Bluestone. So he does have a little place in pop culture history with that very famous National Lampoon magazine cover. Next is a performer by the name of Claire Falconbridge, of British descent. And again, after Laugh-In didn't do much on this side of the Atlantic, she did a little bit of stuff on the other side of the Atlantic. She did 87 episodes of Crossroads from 1980 to 1985. She did 2 episodes of The Jim Davidson Show in 1981. Does Greg have anything to say?
What did you just say?
Well, we're talking about The Jim Davidson Show.
The Joe Davidson Show.
Wrong show, Greg, but whatever.
Moving on from Claire Falconbridge, we had a gentleman named Lenny Schultz, and really, I'm saying this the nicest way possible I can about Lenny Schultz. He is one weird guy. The thing is, I've seen him in the past. I don't know if I remember seeing him on late night shows back in the 80s and early 90s. If he did stuff like Comic Strip Live or other sort of stand up shows, I remember him, but I can't find anything worthwhile on him on IMDb. He isn't one of those people who, after Laughing, slithered to obscurity. Like I said, I definitely saw him on talk shows or comedy shows in the 80s and maybe even early 90s, but none of them are IMDb worthy. Go figure. But yeah, he is. I think weird is the best way of summing it up. He's very goofy, very just weird. He brings the very bizarre comedy to Laugh-In. Next is Kim Braden. And Kim Braden, after Laugh-In, she actually did have a little career after Laugh-In. She played Picard's wife on Star Trek Generations. No reaction about Picard's wife?
Well, she was a minor character in Generations. It's
Picard's wife is minor?
Yeah.
Well, I can understand that in the grand scheme of things, but still, it's the lead character's wife. That's not insignificant in my opinion, but again, I'm deferring to you two because you're the Star Trek experts around here. But also, I see she was on an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation as Ensign Janet Brooks.
Was it a Pulaski episode?
from 1990, so probably.
It was season 4, episode 10, The Loss.
Not a Pulaski episode.
Oh, darn.
I'm not playing that clip. Even though I think it's hilarious in retrospect, that happened on the episode of that one series in the late 80s and early 90s on an episode titled Good to the Last Drop.
She also played the lead in the Anne of Avonlea miniseries from 1975 that they love to rerun on PBS all the time.
Next, we have June Gable. And June Gable, she actually had a career after Laugh-In. Specifically, she was on 7 episodes of Dream On from 1990 to 1996. But also, she was a semi-regular on Shana Na, going back to the late 70s there after Laugh-In. But she also had a couple of appearances before Laugh-In on Barney Miller. She was Detective Maria Batista. And even nowadays, she's still somewhat active. She was in something called Maestro in 2023 and Somewhere in Queens in 2022. So there is life after Laugh-In if you're lucky. If you're June Gable or Bill Rafferty or Sergio Aragones or basically any of these last 3 people we're going to talk about. First, we'll start with Ben Powers. Not with us any longer. He died in 2015. You might know him as Keith Anderson on the last season of Good Times. He married Thelma Evans, Bernadette Stanis's character. But he was also on 13 episodes of The New Mike Hammer, did a couple of episodes of Laverne and Shirley. So he had a little bit of a life after Laugh-In. But these next 2, they definitely had life after Laugh-In. Waylon Flowers. Boy, where should we start with him? We could talk about Madam's Place. We could talk about Hollywood Squares. He just did, I don't want to say everything in the 70s and early 80s, but he was one of those well-known puppeteers from the late 70s and early 80s. And he did his thing on Laugh-In. He did his puppeteering, not just with Madam, but also he had an African-American character by the name of Jiffy. And that's not going to fly necessarily in the 2020s. I'm getting into uncomfortable territory. I'm going to just keep it at Jiffy and we're going to move on. I purposely saved the biggest name for last. The biggest name to come out of this show, sadly hasn't been with us for 10 years, believe it or not, is Robin Williams. This was a year before Mork and Mindy, and I don't think we need to go through his resume terribly deep about what he's done. Good Morning Vietnam, Mrs. Doubtfire, Popeye. The list goes on and on and on. And actually, due to the popularity of Mork and Mindy, NBC reran Laugh-In 1979, capitalizing off the Robin Williams factor. Before we get to the guest stars on the different episodes, I really do want to focus on the writing credits because there are some really good writers on this show who went on to bigger and better things. First and foremost, Argus Hamilton. He was very well known as a satirist, and he made appearances on TV shows in the 80s and 90s. I remember seeing him, and thanks to Adam Neediff, good friend of the show, for posting this, he was actually a semi-occasional panelist on the New Gong Show in the 1980s. Never thought we'd get a new Gong Show reference on this podcast, and lo and behold, here we are. Another writer that made it big after Laugh-In, and actually he did do writing on the original Laugh-In too, believe it or not, is Digby Wolfe. He would go on to be a writer on Real People, and he did writing on the new Mr. Black show in 1972. See how I covered my ass there? Ha 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 ha. The third name among the writers that I want to cover, and this I think is the biggest name of all, Merrill Markoe wrote on all 6 episodes. And that name should be very familiar if you are a big Late Night with David Letterman fan, because she did writing for him. And actually, back in the day, she dated him. But yeah, big name there with Merrill Markoe. In terms of the episodes, we're not going to get into specifics of each episode. Like I said, it's very much like Laugh-In in the 60s and 70s, just with new people, new faces, some updated types of skits and whatnot. I told you about the party is now the disco, and the sight gags now are animated and also typed out and stuff. So we're more focused on the guests because they did get a number of really high caliber guests for this series. So we're going to start with episode 1. And in episode 1, listen to this. For the first episode, these are some amazingly huge names. I think the first person I'm going to mention is huge, but a different type of huge. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And you also had Betty Davis. Betty Davis doing a comedy show. I'm sorry. I would never think Betty Davis would do a comedy like this. But lo and behold, she was one of the guests on this show, as was James Garner and Barry Goldwater. Where did they get Barry Goldwater from in 1977? Wow.
Wasn't he still a sitting U.S. senator at the time?
Yes.
But he wasn't running for president, so that's why I'm sort of like, where did they get him from? I mean, I don't think he was necessarily running for anything bigger than maybe state office at that point, or state senatorialship, if you will. And Rich Little was a guest performer. Roddy McDowell, Ralph Nader. That is a very diverse cast for episode 1. And also Henry Winkler. They got him from Happy Days somehow. So that's just episode 1. In episode 2, the guests included B. Arthur, and this would have been the last season of Maude. And you also had Henry Fonda and Rich Little once again. Roger Moore, they got 007 on this episode. And Seals and Crofts, and another guest star, a name from the 70s, not somebody you'd remember nowadays, Rodney Allen Rippey. He was one of those child actors back in the 70s. Very big at the time, but unfortunately, since probably about 1977, he hasn't had much of a career. If I remember correctly, he is best well known for doing commercials, specifically Jack in the Box commercials. Episode 3, this first person, it doesn't get much bigger than this person in 1977. You had Frank Sinatra, old Blue Eyes himself, but also you had Cindy Williams coming over from Laverne and Shirley, Flip Wilson, James Garner again, and Barry Goldwater appeared again. Episode 4, you had Shirley MacLaine, Martin Mull, and actually Martin Mull, he didn't just appear on one episode, he appeared on, I think, 3 episodes, not necessarily as a guest star. I mean, he acted almost more like part of the repertoire. But Martin Mull made appearances here, and this would have been, I believe, during the America Tonight era, not Fernwood Tonight, but America Tonight. So he was a pretty big name at this point. Roger Moore once again, Sonny Bono, Marjo Gortner, and Flip Wilson. And Bella Abzug. How about that for a name? Bella Abzug.
This is the first time since the Bicentennial Minute we've mentioned her.
Again, another person I wouldn't necessarily associate with being on a comedy show, but here she is, Bella Abzug. And believe it or not, John Barber was on this episode. John Barber of, among other things, Real People and The New Liars Club.
Hold on a second. His son's favorite show, as we all know, was Frank's Place. And who was his favorite actor from that show, Mike?
Shadi LaRue. Do I need to pull up the clip? Does he need to tell us his son's favorite character is Shadi LaRue?
Yes.
My son's favorite character from my son's favorite show, he plays Shotty LaRue in Frank's Place, Don Yesso.
Even though the character's name wasn't Shadi LaRue, it was Shorty LaRue. But hey, it was his son's favorite character, so you know Dad's got to know his son's favorite character's actual name. Shadi LaRue. Well, we also had Robert Conrad on this episode, on top of all the other performers I mentioned. Bella Abzug, John Barber, and Robert Conrad. 3 people who definitely have never been in my kitchen. Episode 5, we've got some big names on this episode. We have Sonny Bono again. We have Martin Mull also, and Ralph Nader. But the 2 big guests on this episode, Jimmy Stewart and his wife Gloria, but also Tina Turner. And boy, Tina Turner got down on that episode. Of course, yeah, she's got the good legs and is a hell of a dancer. She just, I think, stole the show in my opinion. And then the last episode, Joan Rivers and Gore Vidal appeared. Gore Vidal. Again, another name that I wouldn't normally associate with a comedy show. But actually, you know, Gore Vidal, I shouldn't single him out that way, because he did do an episode of Family Guy before his passing. He did that sort of NPR type of radio show with Brian Griffin where Stewie was throwing, I believe, hot dogs at girls' backsides, if you remember that. Don't make me feel alone in saying I'm the only person who remembers that, because that's kind of creepy.
It is kind of creepy, but you are not the only person who remembers that.
Thank you very much for saying that. Your silence was sort of saying I was veering into sort of creepy territory. And actually, Tina Turner appeared on the final episode as well, as did Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as did B. Arthur, as did Betty Davis. This, I believe, if I remember correctly, with all these former guest stars, it was essentially a retrospective. I don't want to call it a bottle episode, but ... You did have a lot of the previous guests from the other 5 episodes appearing in this finale of the series. So the series itself, I said it was very intermittently placed on the schedule. The first episode aired on September 5th of 1977, but then episode 2 did not air until October 10th of 1977. Episode 3 aired on October 28th of 77, but then episode 4, you had to wait almost 2 months to get episode 4. It aired on December 20th of 1977. And then episodes 5 and 6 actually aired on consecutive weeks, February 1st of 1978 and February 8th of 1978. Another thing I noticed while doing research for this episode, it seemed there were a lot of critics about the series in terms of the humor, and it's not the laugh-in that we had 5 to 10 years earlier. But interestingly enough, I could only find ratings for one show, the second episode, October 10th of 1977, and for the week, it was actually 19th in the ratings out of 63 shows. That's not bad. That's top third. And taking a look at the shows, I don't have the list of shows in front of me, but it beat many shows which lasted a long time. Notice I didn't summon John Davidson there, a very long time. I went through the list and it's like, these are some really good shows that it beat. Some high-quality TV shows from 1977. So people were watching, at least on episode 2. I don't have any sort of ratings for any other episode, but obviously something happened. Maybe having a 2-month gap, month and a half gap between shows may have killed some of the momentum. But I did take a look at some of the competition, and I believe it was on generally at 9 o'clock, and I did see it went up against shows like Charlie's Angels and other big shows in that time slot, and the dates weren't fixed. So it might have aired on a Wednesday one time and on a Monday another time and a Thursday another time. So maybe just moving it around wasn't necessarily the best thing, but also maybe not taking over 5 months to air 6 episodes was not the best strategy either. But again, NBC, when they said they were bringing back Laugh-In, they did say it was going to be a special that aired throughout the 77-78 season, not a fixed in stone, okay, we're going to show it on this night of the week every week for 6 weeks. So maybe NBC, well, this is about the time that NBC started making some really bad decisions. I'm not trying to include Laugh-In in those decisions because we all know what's going to come down in like 78 and 79, but maybe this is like a precursor of what's to come in later years, in the late 70s and early 80s for NBC. I don't know. There is one more thing we need to add about the Laugh-In series, because there was a little bit of legal issues with the TV show, because Dan Rowan and Dick Martin actually sued George Slatter over this version of Laugh-In. The reason being, and if you watch the old reruns, wherever they may be, I know they're on, I think, Tubi, and they were on Z Living, at least when I had it. But if you watch those episodes, you'll see that George Slatter was credited as a producer, but so were Dan Rowan and Dick Martin in the form of the Romart production company. Well, there's one problem, and the problem is Dan Rowan and Dick Martin did not give them permission to revive Laugh-In. So Rowan and Martin sued George Slatter for using the format without their permission, since it wasn't just a George Slatter show. And in 1980, Rowan and Martin won a judgment of $4.6 million. If you would like to see Laugh-In from 1977, there's great news. Because within the last couple of months, the YouTube channel by the name of Clown Jewels, not Crown Jewels, but Clown Jewels, they have all 6 episodes online. There's some annoying bugs there, but hey, it's a YouTube channel, and you almost expect big, huge, ugly, annoying bugs when you go to YouTube. But they're there. Make your own decision as to whether Laugh-In was decent, funny, what have you. Now I think we can officially close up Laugh-In. Yes, Laugh-In brought us some future stars, some big talents. Yes, Laugh-In brought a lot of stuff from the old show back, but also at the same time, yes, Laugh-In did not get everybody's permission and was very costly to George Slatter. And in the end, Laugh-In, it was just a thing on TV. But really, I think it's one of those things on TV that maybe if it was in the oven for a little bit longer, might have been a little bit better. I want to like Laugh-In, but like I said, Lenny Schultz, he's just bizarre. I think he really is unlike anybody who has been on Laugh-In previously. Yeah, I don't think getting rid of one person would fix anything, but wouldn't have hurt, I think, in my opinion, if they got rid of him. With that, I'd like to remind you to please go to our website at itwasthethingontv.com, and you can catch up with all our previous episodes. We're almost at 500 episodes. We're actually going to be there in 2 weeks. So set your alarms. 2 weeks, we're going to be at 500. It's going to be absolutely epic. But also, don't forget, in addition to those almost 500 episodes that preceded this one, we've got mini-sodes, we got live shows, we got extended versions, instant reactions, delayed reactions, all sorts of good stuff there. But also, please remember, we are on social media, talking about Instagram, Threads, and Mastodon at It Was The Thing on TV, except for Facebook, where we're at It Was The Thing on TV podcast. And please remember, if you want to find us at Mastodon, you need to do a search for us at It Was The Thing on TV at tvwatch.party. And also, don't forget, we are wherever podcasts can be found, including iHeartRadio, TuneIn Radio, Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Audible, independent podcast players. You can find us just about anywhere. And please also don't forget, we're on YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell to stay informed on everything we're going to do on our channel. including what's going to be on the podcast Thursday. Oh, Thursday. I think there's one phrase I can use to describe this episode that's coming up. Snooch to the nooch.
Snoogans.
Well, you'll just have to stay tuned for it in our next episode of It Was a Thing on TV. And we'll see you with that episode on Thursday. Wow.